China.
China has extended a package of stimulus measures for its troubled real estate sector.
Meanwhile, a seismic shift is underway in the world of finance and real estate.
Evergrande saw its stock value drop 80% as it came back from a 17-month trading suspension on Monday.
It's a housing slump which could be much worse than official data is showing. Can you tell us why and why investors watching the property market are concerned?
Over the past few weeks, I've been trying to piece together this puzzle. I've been trying to figure out how the Chinese real estate sector went from driving the country's economy to almost destroying it.
Not long ago, this entire area was farmland. Now, it's a case study for how cruel the Chinese housing boom can be.
And to be honest with you, I was expecting to walk out of this story thinking that China will somehow find a way to redeem itself at the end. That the government will figure out a way to get them out of this mess like they always do. But the more I dug into this story, the more it became evident that this problem isn't going away. China is in deep, deep trouble, and I feel like more people should be talking about this. So I decided to make this video to break down everything I found during the last 2 weeks researching the Chinese real estate crisis. And spoiler alert, it's much, much worse than you probably think it is. Okay, so let's start from the basics, right? The real estate sector is the pillar of the Chinese economy. Nearly 25 to 30% of the entire country's GDP comes from the real estate sector alone. And if you ask the Chinese government why the real estate sector is so dominant, they'll give you a simple answer. Until recently, China had the world's largest population, and the government had to house this population. So over the last few decades, the Communist Party of China turned the country from a sleeping rural landscape to a massive construction site. And the pace at which they did this is frankly scary. When they assumed power in 1949, the country had 69 cities, and today they have nearly 700 cities. And within each city, you have hundreds and thousands of schools, apartment complexes, shopping malls, skyscrapers, administrative buildings, and a giant ecosystem to support the burgeoning population. So it makes sense, right, that the real estate sector is such a massive part of the Chinese economy. Yes, but there's a small problem with that argument. See, according to the latest data I could find, over 90% of all Chinese households already have a home. Nearly 20% have 2 homes. So if pretty much everybody in the country has a roof over their head, then why does China still need to continue to build new cities? At first, this didn't make any sense to me. But then I looked at China's property laws, and slowly a pattern began to emerge. Property laws in China, it's not like in India. In India, if you buy a piece of land and you make sure that the paperwork is right, it's your land, it's your property, and the government recognizes this right. In China, all urban land is owned by the government. The government in turn will lease the land to developers for 50 or 70 years, and the developers can then build properties on it and sell it to customers. For local governments, this leasing business is an important source of revenue. Let me give you an example. If there's a large piece of rural land in China, it's collectively owned by the villages, not the government. But the central and the provincial governments can choose to scale up cities to meet the demands of the urban population. And once they draft a detailed plan, the decision making goes to local municipalities. And one thing you need to know about local municipalities in China, it's that they're always broke. They're broke as well. So their incentive is to make as much money as possible, and if they can repurpose rural land into urban land, they'll do it immediately. They'll rezone it to either residential or industrial land and lease it to businesses. But there's also another interesting thing. When they lease industrial land, they don't make a lot of money upfront, since industries take a lot of time to thrive. The cash flows are distributed over many years. But for residential land, they can lease it to developers immediately and get cash upfront. So whenever they need money, all they have to do is simply rezone rural land into residential land, evict the villagers, and maybe offer some compensation to residents if they're feeling generous. It's an extremely profitable enterprise. In India, this kind of thing would create riots. People would go to the streets. There would be 24/7 television shows talking about the government's apathy. But in China, these bulldozing events rarely make the news. In fact, between 2009 and 2015, 53 people self-immolated themselves to protest their eviction. They burned themselves to death. In 2013, 13 people in Wuhan drank pesticides in a mass suicide attempt. One man even decided to bomb government buildings to protest against the government's high-handedness. Unfortunately, most of these events garnered little media attention, and local government kept developing new land anyway with little resistance. In fact, this develop and lease business model is so profitable for municipalities that one analyst believes most municipalities would immediately go bankrupt if they stopped receiving money from real estate companies. So even if there is no need to develop new homes, local governments have to keep developing and selling new land, because otherwise they wouldn't survive. They wouldn't have enough money. And that's the first piece of the puzzle solved. But you know what I realized? That this only begets another bigger question. I understand the incentives for local governments to keep developing new land, but if there's no need for new homes, why do real estate companies keep buying or leasing new land from local governments? Shouldn't they be worried about flats going unsold? Technically they should, but you need to understand something about Chinese real estate developers also. In the mid-1990s, the Chinese government introduced a few housing reforms that would change the entire landscape of the real estate industry altogether. Until then, people couldn't buy and sell homes. The government owned and allocated property to its citizens. But once the government opened the door for privatization, real estate developers started mushrooming across the country. On the one hand, they started building new apartments in previously desolate locations, like creating entirely new cities. On the other hand, they also began tearing down old buildings and replacing it with something new, since the old government buildings were poorly maintained anyway. And here's something interesting. At the time, the government offered 60 to 70-year leases, and once they leased the land to developers, the developers couldn't keep it vacant. They had to build something on it within 1 year. So even if there was no demand, they would build something anyway in the hopes that people would move in sometime in the future. And they believed that the government would make this happen even if they couldn't make it happen themselves. And if there's one thing you should know about the Chinese government, it's that they don't wait for things to happen. They make things happen. So if they feel like populating a new city, they would simply build an education institution or a government or an administrative building and force government employees and students to move here. They can bring an entire city alive just by waving a pen. And real estate developers, mostly state-owned, believe that the people would come. And this explains the ghost cities of China. Massive apartment buildings and shopping malls in China completely empty with no people whatsoever. And every news report from the time will have you convinced that these ghost cities were a massive blunder from the Chinese government's part, that they got all of this wrong. But that's not accurate at all. The more I studied about this, the more I realized that it's not like the government didn't see it coming. It's what the government intended. This was their plan. They built cities and buildings for the future because they couldn't wait until they had a massive population. They wanted to be ahead of the game, and real estate developers saw an opportunity everywhere they went. This is why they kept building new apartments. This is why they were making an investment for the future. And this brings me to the third piece of the puzzle: the Chinese people. Owning a home in China is a status symbol, far greater than in India. And real estate has also traditionally been one of the few ways in which people could save and make money. The bank savings rate in China is very bad. The stock market is too volatile. And real estate is one of the very few places where there has been a consistent appreciation in prices. This meant people simply bought a home because it was the best investment opportunity available. In fact, this explains why 20% of Chinese households have more than one home. It's a speculative investment. They want to make more money off of this. So there's always new demand. More importantly, the Chinese government has consistently offered low interest rates to home loan borrowers. They wanted people to buy new homes because real estate is such an important part of their economy. So once you put together all of this, I believe we have a simple summary of what's happening. The Chinese government wants to house everyone, and so they design policies to scale up entire cities. Local municipalities need the money, so they develop new land and lease it to real estate company. Real estate developers keep building new properties in the hope that they will eventually make a return on investment even if there's nobody buying property right now. And Chinese customers buy new homes not just to live in them, but because they believe it's a good way to make money. They believe real estate prices will keep going up. This is the cycle that has kept the Chinese economy going up for 3 decades now. Unfortunately, all cycles turn, and the only thing that has kept the real estate cycle from going bust is the prices. For 3 decades now, housing prices have kept growing no matter what. But now there's a problem. Look at this graph. Housing prices have been going down since the second half of 2021, and prices have not recovered yet. Now, these are the official numbers from the National Bureau of Statistics in China. The actual numbers are likely even worse, and this tells us that for some reason the Chinese public have lost faith in the real estate market. They are now looking to sell their properties even if it means taking a loss. So the real question is, how did this happen? Well, the first part is obvious. COVID ruined the Chinese economy. The zero COVID policy was disastrous. The Chinese government would simply close down entire cities the moment a single case cropped up. Businesses lost their confidence, employees lost their jobs, and all of this had an impact on people's perception of the future. Many people simply wanted to sell their homes and boost their savings to prevent economic uncertainty from affecting their household. But when they entered the market to sell their homes with confidence, they found thousands of other people looking to sell their homes as well. There were too many sellers, far few buyers, and prices moderated. In some cases, it even dipped, it fell. And once people began noticing that prices weren't recovering, they panicked even more. And there was another bigger problem. Over the last few years, it had become evident that real estate companies had borrowed too much money to build houses very few people needed in the first place. They had hundreds of billions of dollars worth of debt, and to prevent companies from taking even more debt, the Chinese government implemented a 3 red line policy. In simple words, this means they identified a set of systematically important real estate companies. They audited these companies and wanted to know how bad their situation was. And depending on the answer to that question, they put a limit on the kind of money each company could borrow. So imagine if you were a real estate developer and you were in a really bad position. Then you couldn't borrow any more money. And you can see the government's logic here. Like, if I had personally borrowed a lot of money and my income and assets were not as great, a financial advisor would suggest I stop borrowing more money. But think about it. For real estate companies, this meant that they couldn't develop any new properties. They just didn't have the funds for it. And with no means to borrow and no means to grow, the Chinese government effectively pushed them to bankruptcy. And the problem is, this doesn't just affect the developers, this affects the entire financial institution in the country. Real estate companies weren't just borrowing from banks, they were borrowing from something called as trust companies. Now, banks, when they're lending, they're expected to do a lot of due diligence. But trust companies, they were bound by very few regulations, and they could actually raise money from banks and qualified investors and pour that money into shady real estate projects if they wanted to. They could even raise money by promising investors steady monthly or yearly returns, steady returns. And you can see the problem with that, don't you? You can't promise fixed returns and raise money if you're investing that money in real estate projects where the developers rarely pay you back on time. It's a very dangerous game to play. And just like that, the moment real estate companies started defaulting on their obligation, the contagion spread like crazy. Just a few days ago, one of China's largest property developers, Evergrande, filed for bankruptcy in the US.
The company, which was once China's top property development developer, has been struggling with more than $300 billion in liabilities since 2021.
Another massive developer, once China's biggest real estate company, Country Garden, is also expected to go bankrupt by the end of the year. Meanwhile, the trust companies that funded these real estate companies, they're shaking in their boots. Zongrong Trust, a company that manages $108 billion worth of funds, stopped making payments to its investors recently. They're saying it's a short-term problem precipitated by the real estate crisis. But really, is it? Is it really a short-term problem? And if the property market doesn't improve, what happens to the billions of dollars invested in real estate? The money that people invested in real estate? What happens to the local municipalities that depend on land sales to generate their revenue? And what happens to the economy that derives nearly 40% of the value from real estate? This could have massive consequences for the country. And remember how we began this story by talking about how China wants to house its ever-increasing population? Well, that population isn't increasing anymore. The one-child policy for China was a remarkable success story. It contained their population. But now there's a vacuum. Without young people, the country's GDP may go back to being average at best. It could spell the end of Chinese dominance, and it could all be starting now, happening as we speak. This is why I think more people should be paying attention to what's happening in China. Unlike in previous situations, this is what we call a perfect storm, one that I don't think has happened in recent memory. And I wish I could tell you when all of this will go down or whether it will all go down, but the truth is I don't know. China is still remarkably a very opaque economy. Even the best analysts get things wrong. Maybe the Chinese government will pull out another magic trick and all will be well. Or maybe this is the beginning of the end. All I can do is share with you what I found, and hopefully you can decide for yourself which way China is headed. You can decide if there will be a new order emerging in the next few years. Also, it would mean the world to me if you could like and share this video with your friends and family. We are trying to get to 50,000 subscribers by the end of this month, and if you like the content that we do on this channel, please don't forget to subscribe. We will have more interesting content for you very soon. Finally, one more thing. My company Ditto Insurance is looking to hire new advisors for our insurance advisory platform. It's honestly an amazing role where you can work from home, and we have a median salary of nearly 50,000 rupees for advisors. And you don't even need to know anything about the insurance industry if you're applying. All you need to have is good communication skills and an urgency to learn. Everything else we will teach you. So yeah, if this role interests you or you know anyone who may be interested, please check out the link in the description and the comment section below, and please do consider applying. That's it from me this week. I will see you soon. Until then, take care. Bye bye.